So the question I'd like us to think about is, let me get this out of the way. What's a human? So that's basically what I want us to do. And I'd like to bring Ilyenkov into conversation with contemporary theoretical biology and kind of Vygotsky to some extent as well. So, my answer is going to have something to do with images and representations. So let's start with the famous distinction made by Marx. What distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is that the architect builds a cell in his mind before he constructs it in wax. At the end of every labour process, a result emerges which had already been conceived by the worker at the beginning, hence already existed ideally. Man not only effects a change of form in the materials of nature, he also realises his own purpose in those materials. So that's a kind of preliminary answer to what's a human, what is unique about humans, but it's potentially problematic in a number of ways. It seems to champion a kind of romantic view of the rational individual imposing his will on nature, and also relies on a concept of mental images that could fall prey to dualism. Is it separating material labour from mental images? If it is, then that's a big problem. Ilyenkov endorses the distinction that Marx makes here, but I think avoids all of these pitfalls, so let's explore that. So first let's start with what bees and architects have in common. For Ilyenkov, the most basic prerequisite for a living organism is the active motion of the organism among bodies of the external world, among the obstacles that impede self-closure of the cycle of exchange with its external environment. Okay, so what's self-closure? What's self-production? If you think of a beaver building a dam, in some ways a dam builds a beaver as well, and what you have there is, with the beavers and the dam, is a kind of a closed system, so it's organizationally closed, they mutually depend on each other, and there's a kind of equilibrium that's reached there. And this is indeed exactly what was said some years later by inactivist theories in biology and cognitive science, so Materialism and Varela, to define an organism in terms of its self-production and self-distinction within an organism environment system. The key point that Majorano and Varela make, which is innovative, is that an organism is in its activity in a concrete environment. You can't just have a beaver in a vacuum. A beaver is to do with doing beavery stuff and being in a beavery environment. So that's already interesting, and that's what was kind of in that quote. More recently, Ezekiel DiPaolo and colleagues suggested a kind of development here, because with the Majorano and Varela, you've got a kind of Spinozist, harmonious unity of the organism and the environment. It's like the organism has everything that they need, and it's just this cycle that goes round and round. What DiPaolo emphasizes is that actually a lot of what defines an organism is to do with crisis, it's to do with breaks, with disequilibrium, because the future of an organism is always precarious. We'll park that for a second. Let's go back to images. So here's the architect with an image in his mind. What is an image? So Ilyenkov suggests that an image, the form of an image, the contours of an image, are all to do with obstacles or constraints in activity. The image is the schema corrected by the form of the obstacle to its actualization, the representation of the form of the object in the form of the action. So let me present this in the Vygotskian way. We've got a bird down here, and the bird needs to eat, and the object of the bird's activity is fish. So a bird's activity is structured around that fish, but it's structured around that fish by way of ripples in the water. So the bird uses ripples in the water to organize its own activity. The reason we know that's an image, that's not just direct extension of the fish is actually the bird could dive in and find it was just a fruit that dropped in the water, but equally I throw a stone in the lake, bird's flying along, sees the ripples, but then actually the bird is now attuned in such a way that it knows, okay, those are not the kinds of ripples that a fish makes. And in fact, I'm more likely to be fooled by ripples on the lake being a fish than the bird is, because for a bird that is an image that's quite granular in a way that it's not for me, because that's the bird's activity. So that's what an image is for the bird. And this is very much in line with the organizational approach in biology and in activism. Moreno and Mosio define biological autonomy in this sense. So what we have is that the ripples in the water constrain activity, and these constraints are emergent from relations of the functional parts of a dynamic system. It's not about any atomistic reductionism, it's only in the dynamics that these constraints emerge, and these are the constraints of the system as a whole, and the constraints structure the activity without themselves being transformed by it. That's a key innovation by Moreno and Mosio, who've never read Ilyenkov, but the point is that autonomy involves selecting constraints that are in line with my purposes, my needs. But this is still about bees and architects. Ilyenkov says at this point, there proves to be no fundamental difference between the architect and the bee. A cell made of wax, which a bee sculpts, has its prior moment in the form of the activity of an insect, which has been programmed in its nerve center. In this sense, the product of a bee's activity is also fixed ideally prior to its actualization. Okay, so what about architects? Why are architects special? In a word, reification. The human being, and only the human being, immediately ceases to merge with the form of her life activity, separating it from itself and placing it before herself, that is, transforming it into representation, Ilyenkov says later in the same essay. Okay, so the process by which this happens, to give a practical example, Ilyenkov was very involved and interested in this Vygotsky School for Deaf and Blind Children, that in fact was very successful and innovative, especially within the Soviet Union. And thanks to this school, there were deaf and blind kids who grew up to have PhDs, to be teachers themselves, to have lives that were full of flourishing. And here he is describing some of the pedagogical approach of the school. I think this is a great example of kind of alienation or disequilibrium that forms humanity. The child does not want to eat with a spoon. He resists and tries as before to thrust his mouth into the bowl, but they do not let him. Instead, they stick something in between his mouth and the bowl, some sort of very inconvenient object, superfluous to the old mode, superfluous and incomprehensible, a mediating link. And this mediating link requires unfamiliar actions of him, actions the schemas for which are inscribed neither in the organic need itself, nor in the object, say in the porridge, but only in the form and designated purpose of a spoon, or towel, potty, table, chair, bed, etc. Okay, so how is a chair for a child different to ripples in the water for a fish? Let me use Vygotsky's favourite example. Children using a stick as a horse while pretending that they're cops and robbers. Okay, so the stick is a horse, but where is the horse? Is the horse in the stick? Is the horse in the children's mind? So Ilyenkov's point would be that this is the wrong question to ask. Play involves dynamics of repetition and spontaneity which reproduce the conditions for properties of the object, like the shape and sturdiness of the stick, but not its colour or grain pattern, to have the affordances it has in the game situation. But for the stick to be a horse in the game involves implications or powers unrelated to its properties as a stick. For example, the horse could be fast, brave, or in need of feeding. This symbolic ideal meaning functions in a system of social relations that is distinct from the iconic systems in which it is expressed. So, how does Ilyenkov synthesize all of this? The first point is that, yes, the image is in the head of the architect, but that head is not his individual brain, it's the whole of inorganic matter. So if you think of the child learning to use a spoon, the spoon is part of his head, the teachers are part of the head. It's a whole system that we need to account for if we talk about the head. So in the case of an architect's drawing, got in some ways a similar structure. So you've got architecture as a practice that has an object, which is building the house, and the architectural drawing or plan is used to build the house. The difference is that the practice brings the image into this mediating relationship. There's nothing in itself about the architectural drawing other than the fact that within activity it forms a mediating link just through the enactment of that activity. So Ilyenkov phrases this in a far more inactivist way than I just have. The architect builds the house not just in the head, but with the aid of her head, by way of representation, directly on drawing paper, on the surface of a drawing board. By doing so, she changes her inner condition, bringing it into the open and acting with it, as though with an object different from herself. Modifying this reified subject, inner image, she also potentially changes the image of the real house. That is, she changes it ideally in its potentiality. Architectural drawing is also sensuously objective activity, changing the sensuously perceived appearance of that thing to which it is directed. But the thing in whose change this activity is expressed is merely the reified representation or the form of human activity recorded as a thing. Okay, so they're both things, except one of them is acting as a representation, and it's through this reified state that it's able to have that. I'm kind of mainly out of time. This is like super complex to discuss. I'll just very briefly mention that. Okay, so I mentioned alienation. One of the points that Ilyenkov discusses that I don't have time to talk about is that in Marx too, there are different kinds of alienation. Under capitalism, they're both the same, and so that's bad. But with a child learning to use a spoon, that's a kind of in Tausserong alienation, because it's disequilibrium for the child, but the metabolism as a whole, the dynamic system as a whole, can grasp it can reproduce the closure, maintain the metabolic process, etc. Under capitalism, what we have are various cybernetic systems of control, etc., where actually the alienation is estranging, and the child isn't brought into this relationship of enculturation as that deaf and blind child was. All right, thanks.
Thank you, Peter.